Is it on? Okay, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for taking the time to come this morning. Welcome to Pitzer College. My name is Emily Butts, and I'm the Director of Curatorial Affairs and Pitzer College's Art Galleries, as well as the curator of Atomic Dragons, which is the exhibition that brought us here today. Before I get into things, I want to note a few housekeeping items. So in an effort to reduce waste, we made our program digital this year. So you can scan this QR code behind me, and you'll see the bios and schedule for today. There's also some of that information on our website as well. You may have also seen bathrooms in the auditorium's lobby, and then there's also exits, 4 exits behind you and 2 in front as well that I want to point out. So I want to walk you through today's agenda. So in a moment, I'll introduce our first speaker, Jim Walsh. He's the Senior Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies program. Following his presentation, I'll introduce our second speaker, David Richardson, Associate Dean of Research and Professor of Environmental and Occupational Health at UC Irvine. After both of those presentations, Ellen O'Hara-Slavic, one of the exhibiting artists who has deep connections to both speakers and their work, will be facilitating a Q&A. We'll break for lunch around 12:45, and during that time, we encourage you to go visit the exhibition. At 2:15, we'll reconvene for our afternoon panel, which will be a panel with the artists from Swans, moderated by Tamara Cedre, artist and visiting professor of photography here at Pitzer, followed by another Q&A. Now, first, I want to acknowledge the artists who made this exhibition and this day possible. Atomic Dragons features the intergenerational feminist collective Swans, which stands for Slow War Against the Nuclear State. The group formed in 2022 when LA-based artist Nancy Buchanan brought together a group of artists to her home. And from that meeting, they made a commitment to continue working together. The group consists of Nancy Buchanan, Sheila Pinkel, Judith Dankoff, Hillary Mushkin, Ellen O'Hara-Slavic, Fiona Abmanson, and Lucy H.G. Solomon. 3 of the artists grew up with fathers directly involved in the nuclear industry, and 2 had parents who were anti-war and anti-nuclear activists. Collectively, their work draws on feminist art lineages, decolonial practice, and anti-nuclear environmental activism that connect the personal and the political. And what runs through all of this is a shared understanding that the nuclear age is not a single historical event. It's not something that happened at Hiroshima and ended with the Cold War. It's an ongoing condition, one that looms in the background of our daily lives, shaping national security, the environment, and our communities. Only 2 days before this exhibition opened, the START treaty between Russia and the US expired. And just 3 weeks later, the US struck Iran. Very quickly, the conversation shifted to how topical this exhibition is, but the artists and speakers here today have long understood that these nuclear questions have never gone away. 40 years ago, Sheila Pinkel created a work in this exhibition titled Nuclear Questions. In it, she asks, is the strength of a country found in its military rather than its culture? Is fear our gross national product? Can we make the world safe enough so we can once again dream? Those questions are 40 years old, but feel just as relevant today. This exhibition and today's symposium reflect something essential about Pitzer's identity. This is a college founded on the belief that education should be engaged with the world, not apart from it, and that art plays its own role in deepening our connection to the issues that define our time. I would like to thank Murray Pepper and Vicki Reynolds Pepper for their generous support for our Distinguished Visiting Artist and Scholar Lecture Fund, which made today possible. And an extra special thank you to John Meany, the Director of Forensics at Claremont McKenna College and Director of the Claremont College's Debate Union, for his ongoing support. And most importantly, I would like to thank the artists for their dedication and willingness to take on these issues, for never looking away, and for reminding us not to either. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Walsh. Jim Walsh is a senior research associate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Security Studies program. Walsh's research and writings focus on international security, and in particular, topics involving nuclear weapons. Walsh has testified before the United States Senate and House of Representatives on topics relating to nuclear terrorism, Iran, and North Korea. He is one of the relatively small number of Americans who have traveled to both Iran and North Korea for talks with officials about nuclear issues. He is an international security contributor to the NPR program Here and Now, and his comments and analysis have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Washington Post, among many, many others. He has taught at both Harvard University and MIT, and Dr. Walsh received his PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I could go on, but I'm sure you're eager to hear from him, as am I. So please join me in welcoming Jim Walsh.
First test. Can I get the bottle open? We passed that. Well, good morning to you. I'm sorry? Good morning. What a beautiful day in Southern California. I flew from cold New England last night and have arrived to this glory of cactus and sunshine. What better day than to talk about Armageddon? It is nice. We should be talking on the snowy days too, but it is a nice day. And it is the day before Easter, a date in the Christian calendar where Christians celebrate redemption, renewal, and resurrection. And that is what we are here to talk about today. Redemption, renewal, and resurrection, to be saved from the danger that we ourselves have created. I want to take a minute, because you always should, and give thanks where thanks is due, to sponsors. You know, no sponsor, no event. So I want to be sure to thank the Pepper Endowment Fund, and I want to thank in particular John Meany, who, as you've heard, is head of the Claremont College Debate Union, who has built, in my opinion, the largest and most successful debate program in the country, probably the world, but I don't know what they do in the rest of the world. Absolutely. And I'm honored to say that he has been a friend and a mentor to me for more than 50 years, since I was a very, very young person. So I just couldn't be more excited to be here. But let us get on with the proceedings. I will start the timer. No one should be subjected to hearing me talk for more than 30 minutes. OSHA gets involved otherwise. All right. There we go. So here we are. And I'm a nuclear specialist at MIT. And I could not be more happy to be here. And I wrote the talk, this is the first time I've delivered this talk, for this audience, because I think it addresses a central question that is little discussed, and that is the role of art and national security, and in nuclear in particular. Now, this talk is going to focus on four things. Iran, we have to talk about Iran. When your country has attacked another country, and there's a three-party war, and two of the parties have nuclear weapons, and the third is very, very close to having nuclear weapons, you know, I think that's where we should begin. And then we can step back and talk about how did we get here? What does the threat of nuclear war look like today? Today. April, whatever it is, 3rd, I think it is. And then I really want to focus on what I consider to be the necessity of art for the problems that we face. So let's get started with Iran. As you heard, I've been to Iran and North Korea. I've had participated in secret track 2 negotiation meetings with Iranians. Every year for the last 20 years, I've met for an hour and a half, 2 hours with the president of Iran and the foreign minister of Iran. I strongly suspect that streak is going to be broken this year. And I've given expert testimony and worked on the JCPOA, and President Obama was kind enough to write my colleagues and I a handwritten note thanking us for our efforts. Those pictures are from the top one is when I'm in Iran. The lower one was when I'm in New York, where a foreign ministry official was whispering into the ear of President Rouhani, trying to explain what this strange gentleman is doing while he's shaking his hand. So it's something that I've been hard at work at for some years. Now, with respect to the Iranian conflict, as I said, this is a conflict that involves two nuclear weapon states at war. War and nuclear weapons are always a terrible and risky mix. But we have two states with nuclear weapons initiating a war against another country that is a threshold state on the verge of nuclear weapons. But what I would tell you now, by way of context, so that we can step back and see how we got here, is a few points. One, Iran can build nuclear weapons. Okay, they can, and I don't know how you're going to take that away from them. The Director of National Intelligence, our intelligence agencies assessed that Iran had a nuclear weapons capability in 2011. The language in those documents said Iran can build nuclear weapons. The only thing that prevents them from doing so is a political decision. Now, if you've built more than 30,000 centrifuges, if you've built centrifuges that went from an IR1 model up to IR6, if you've produced 9,000 kilograms of enriched uranium that include about 1,000 pounds of 60% enriched uranium, my own belief is you can wipe that all out, you can bomb it away, and that doesn't matter, because you don't bomb away the knowledge in the engineers' heads, you don't bomb away their tacit knowledge and experience, and you don't bomb away the things that they hid in advance. And so my own view, and it's a view that I've put in writing in the New York Review of Books and elsewhere, that an attack, in this case, the current attack, but I've written prior to this, that a US and Israeli attack increases the odds that Iran will build nuclear weapons. It will produce the very thing that the action seeks to avoid, because you've attacked a country that can build them if it wants to. They've so far refused to build them, and now you have given them strong cause. Now, as we look forward to what will happen next in the region, I think Israel, as we say, has nuclear weapons. It's a nuclear weapon state, and it will continue to initiate wars in the region for the foreseeable future. Saudi Arabia lobbied for the war and now must live next to a wounded and angry Iran. And it has to be said that, at least other than the last couple of years, that region has been defined by an intense and ugly rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I suspect that that will grow worse rather than better. And finally, it has to be said that Saudi Arabia, the kingdom, is planning its own nuclear enrichment program, which is partly how we got on this road to begin with, and they're going to do it with US help. And I'm afraid to say that that was a proposal initiated under the Biden administration, and I expect it to find flower and fruition in this administration. So we would have Saudi Arabia with the beginnings of an enrichment program. So that's where we are today in the region. It doesn't look very good, but I don't want to spend all my time on that. We can talk about that in question and answer, as I might imagine. So let's step back from that and ask, how did we get here? You know, the nuclear age is many decades in running, and I think the through line here, or the historical narrative, takes the form of going from a moment of near annihilation, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis, increasingly towards success with respect to nuclear restraint and pulling back from the brink, and then from success to regress. So what does that look like? Let's start with the nuclear dangers. I don't have to tell you that the US used nuclear weapons in World War II, used them twice, would have used them more if they had had more weapons, but they used all the weapons that they had. Then we had near use. That would have been the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not only the Cuban Missile Crisis, but most acutely the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came close to civilizational end. Scholars who study the Cuban Missile Crisis identify 12 separate near-miss incidents, and you look back on it and you think, oh my God, what were they thinking? The U.S. was initially going to invade Cuba, not knowing that Russia or the Soviet Union had already installed nuclear weapons on the island. We did not know that, and we were going to invade. That's just one incident. Another incident, we did not know that Soviet subs had been given the order that if they were forced to surface, they should shoot their nuclear weapons. What did we do? We went hunting for subs and tried to force a sub up, and the commanders of that sub had a meeting to decide whether they should follow orders and launch, and on and on. Cuban Missile Crisis cannot be underestimated as one of the most perilous moments in world history. But there's some other things going on that people are probably less aware of, those last three, so let me zip through those real quick. Whoops, that's the wrong direction. I often move in the wrong direction. Here we go. Nuclear threats. Well, how many times over the course of the era have states armed with nuclear weapons turned to other states and threatened them with the use of nuclear weapons? 32 times. 32 times in 80 years. And that's the list. I know you can't read that. I hate slides where the print's too small, but I put that up there just so you can get a sense of how frequently this has taken place. Threat, 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 threat. Particularly the US, particularly early in the nuclear age. But now these threats are picking up in the last several years. Russia, the United States, and North Korea have all made nuclear threats. But it's not just overt nuclear threats. That's part of it. There's also the situations in which countries with nuclear weapons have secretly met on their own to decide whether to launch a preemptive, or in this case, a preventive nuclear strike. You know, we just had the US and Israel launch a preventative war, that is to say a war not in self-defense, but initiated. And in these cases, these nuclear weapon states considered attacking the other guy first with nuclear weapons in order to eliminate their nuclear capability. The US did it 7 times, met 7 times, considered it and rejected all 7. But it seems to me if you're meeting at a table, voting up or down whether to attack another country in a preventive nuclear war, that's a measure of risk. You don't want meetings like that. We've had meetings like the Russians had meetings. The Russians invited us to join them in a preventive nuclear attack on China in 1969. Then we have wars between nuclear states. Now, if there's ever a bad combination, it is the combination of conventional war where the country is all in, just like Putin is all in on Ukraine, to have conventional war mixed with nuclear weapons, where that is ready at hand. Obviously, the worst possibility there is to have 2 nuclear weapon states fighting each other, where that temptation doubles. And we've had at least 3 wars between nuclear weapon states, between the Soviet Union and China in '69, the Kargil War between India and Pakistan in 1999, and some people will not say this is a war, but I'm including in the list. You have to have a certain number of deaths to qualify as a war. But we did have an India-China border skirmish. And then we've had some other things. The others just listed there, they don't quite fit in the categories. And then finally, there are wars between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. So one country has nuclear weapons, it's fighting a country that doesn't, like the US against Japan in 1945. And so that country that has nuclear weapons is fighting a country that doesn't have them. If it goes badly, those nuclear weapons are, as everyone loves to say, on the table. So those are other instances where nuclear risk rears its ugly head. But the number of wars fought by nuclear weapon states against non-nuclear weapon states is so long that there is no point in me putting it on the slide. The US itself, Iraq, blah, 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 on and on and on. So we've had lots of conflict and lots of threats involving countries who have nuclear weapons. But it's not all doom and gloom. We've also had some tremendous success. And I'm going to tick through some of that success for you. Testing. We were doing above-ground nuclear testing. Well, there's a person in the audience who actually witnessed an above-ground nuclear test. And he said, I was just speaking to him outside, he said it was seared in his brain. I believe it. So we had nuclear tests. They skyrocketed. There was a brief pause in 1958, and then they hit a new peak. But especially after the comprehensive, not the comprehensive test ban, but the limited test ban in 1962, those tests began to go down, down, down. A similar story is seen with the global nuclear arsenals. Build, 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 build as many as you can, build for every kind of weapon you can imagine. A nuclear bazooka, the US had a nuclear bazooka. You would not want to be the soldier firing that because you would be in range. We built every weapon we could, and by the late 1980s, the US and the Soviet Union had approaching 70,000 nuclear warheads. There aren't 70,000 targets, but that would be more, a fraction of that would have been more than enough to end civilization as we know it. But what happens? You know, late 1980s, down, 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 down. Now you'll notice it stabilizes. It stops going down. It's now starting to go up, but it went down, and that's a cause of celebration. That is success. It proves that you can destroy these warheads. The US and the Soviet Union removed 60,000 nuclear warheads during this period. We know how to dismantle. We know how to disarm. It is not a technical obstacle. It is a political and mental obstacle. But in any case, down, down, down. Similarly with the rate of proliferation. Now, if you define the rate of proliferation as the number of new nuclear weapon states per decade, this chart tells you that nuclear proliferation peaked in the 1960s when 3 countries entered the nuclear weapons club, France, China, and Israel. And in every successive decade, the number of new countries joining has gone down. Tremendous success, wholly unexpected. Most experts and military officials, famously Kennedy in a speech, predicted that we would have a cascade, that 2 would lead to 4, 4 would lead to 8, more and more in an unstoppable whirlwind. That didn't happen. We had the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We had other acts of agency that pulled this under control, and the net result was contrary to every expectation. The rate of nuclear proliferation declined. So you could say, I will say, the nuclear arena is the biggest public policy success in the 20th century. Now, I do limit it to the 20th century. We're going to talk about why in a moment. We had no additional nuclear wars. We had fewer nuclear tests over time. We removed and destroyed 60,000 nuclear warheads. We had far fewer nuclear weapon states than predicted. We had far fewer states seeking nuclear weapons today, or at least a few years ago than before. And of the 9 countries that violated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, only 1 went on to become a nuclear weapon state, and that was North Korea. Pretty good. Pretty good. For a while. So then something happened. And what was this thing? What was the most devastating event for progress in nuclear disarmament? I would say it was the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Our fearsome enemy was no more, and I think most Americans, and I don't think anyone can be blamed here, after more than 4 decades of living in the specter of thermonuclear annihilation, people wanted to take a break. They wanted to breathe. They wanted to exhale, and they wanted to put this issue away. So they put it in a box, and they wrapped it up, and they put it in the attic. Naturally, when you do that, what happens next is the forgetting, the amnesia, and the disappearing. The political salience of nuclear war and nuclear weapons went down. It was the top-ranked issue not only of adults, but teenagers in the mid-'80s. Now it's not even on the list. It's just not there. People turned to other things, other concerns, and it was left behind. And when political salience declines, interest, concern, so does the political capital available to hold on to these achievements that you've built. And in the absence of that, what we've seen is a disappearing. The ABM Treaty, the US pulls out of that. INF pulled out of that. JCPOA, that's no more. We ripped that up and then we stomped on it. We just didn't say we're not going to do it. We said anyone who stays in the agreement will punish them, right? People always say, well, we pull out. No, we didn't pull out. We attacked the thing. And then, as recently as this month, New START. Now, two others I think are on life support, the Outer Space Treaty and the Test Ban Treaty. But these were the jewels, not all of them, but a good collection of the jewels that we had found over the course of the nuclear age. Restraints on nuclear weapons, successes and achievements, and we've tossed them away. It is so easy to just tear things up and so hard to build them. But the people doing the tearing don't care. So where does that bring us now? Today, April 3rd, a little after 11:15. Well, the state of nuclear danger today can be summed up this way. We have 9 men, only men. It hasn't always been men, but it's mostly been men, who on a whim can decide for themselves whether they want to destroy a city or a country, and they can have that done in less than 30 minutes. Look at that list. Look at those mugs. How you feeling? But this is what I want to talk about. We've had success, and we had a vibrant contribution by artists in those times past, particularly in the late 50s when there was a global moment of anti-nuclear pushback, let's say 58 to 61, 62. Then again in the mid-80s during the Reagan administration when he scared the hell out of everyone. In that period from, let's call it, he was elected in 80, but we'll call it 79 to 1984, 1985. Tremendous amount of art, visual art, music, theater, books, focused on the nuclear danger. And I suspect that we will, and this exhibit is certainly tribute to that. That impulse has not gone away. It is now being created, and we need it more than ever. And here's why. I've sat in on a lot of meetings, hundreds of meetings with policymakers, presidents, prime ministers, senators, congressmen, heads of nuclear agencies. And all those discussions focus on politics, strategy, and technology. No one ever mentions art in those meetings, never. But I think art is crucial, necessary, in order to save us all. Why? That's an odd thing to say. It seems unlikely on the face of it. But this is a diagnosis in which art is the remedy, art is part of the cure for the disease. Because the disease we have is not a matter of politics or strategy or technology. The primary obstacle we face are the ideas in our heads, the ideas in the heads of policymakers. Nuclear is one of those things that is not ever really used, so our thoughts about it are sort of free-floating and in our heads. We can believe it's this, we can believe it's that. There's nothing really to say which is true, but which we believe matters very much for how we act. Our beliefs and our feelings. And art has the capacity to change how we see, think, and feel in a way that policy arguments do not. And if we see the danger differently, we can create the conditions necessary for change. Now that sounds like a lot of bull, so let me go through that in a more particular and specific way. First, let me talk about art and the peculiarity of the nuclear danger. Nuclear weapons are unique. They have particular special features that other sort of policy problems don't have, and art provides a way to get at these, in my view. The first is that nuclear weapons are hidden from view. The issue is hidden. The submarines are under the water. The missiles are underground. We have codes of secrecy that prevent people like me from understanding most of what has happened in the nuclear age. I mean, I have a pretty good idea about what happened in the US because we have archives, though I don't know what's happened in the last 30 years because you don't get the archives open until after 20 or 30 years. But we have no archives for China. We have no archives for North Korea, and on and on. We had them briefly for Russia, and then they disappeared. no one really is being told or knows the full extent of what is going on. It is hidden from view. Secondly, and most particularly for nuclear weapons, it differs from virtually every other policy problem, every threat we face, because we can't wait for the war to begin to attack the problem. What do I mean by that? You know, if you have problems where there are car accidents at an intersection, people will be hurt, injured, and then city planners will focus and try to solve that problem. You have a disease outbreak, and you go and people die, but you figure out what you did wrong, industrial accidents, poverty, education. You know, in all these domains, there's a problem and it persists, but as the problem persists, you can learn from it, learn lessons about how to deal with it, and implement those lessons to correct the problems. This is not a matter of learning from mistakes. We can't have 4 or 5 nuclear wars to figure this out. We may only get one chance. So we can't wait for the nuclear war to figure out how to save ourselves. And so what that means is that we have to imagine in advance. We have to create that reality for ourselves beforehand if we have a shot at preventing it from happening, which will then be too late. Those are two things. The particular nature of the nuclear danger, it's hidden and you get one shot. You don't get a lot of practice. Then there's the peculiarities of human beings, our predilections. And there are two that I want to focus on in particular. The first is the problem of place. Nuclear weapons were born into a system defined by states, the Westphalian state system from the 1600s. I'm an American, someone else is a Russian, someone else is a South African. We identify and think of ourselves as states, and when your mental frame is that of place is state, country, then what are the greatest concerns? Other countries. Those are the top of your national security threats and have been so for centuries. But that all changed with nuclear weapons. Now it's the weapons that are the threat, not the country. Oh, the country may still be a threat. We may hate them. They may hate us. They may be a bad country, whatever it is. Whatever it is, it's not going to risk annihilation. In the past, you could fight a war. You might win, you might lose. There aren't many countries that just up and die, that just go away, right? Maybe you lose a sliver of land, maybe you compromise, whatever. But here, we're talking about extinction. There aren't many threats at an extinction level for states. But we still, despite the change in objective conditions, we still act as if we are in the old system where our sense of place is dominated by our statehood, our national identity. The focus on the rival and the danger prevents us from stepping back and seeing, no, it's the weapons we each have that are the greater threat to our survival rather than the other. A problem of place. And then there is a second peculiarity with respect to human beings, is the problem of time. All of us have a bias for the short term. I do. And it's made worse by this modern information ecosystem and the technology. I remember my friend, the late Roger Molander, who founded Ground Zero and had worked in the National Security Council under 3 presidents. And he used to say, and he meant this seriously, that back in the day, in those days, working on nuclear issues and security issues, the government's long-term focus was the publication date of Time magazine each week. And the short-term focus was the CBS Evening News. That is just hilarious, how quaint that is, right? Now I think maybe the CBS Evening News is the long-term view, and whatever gets tweeted out is the short-term horizon. But it's shortened for sure, right? We see this. So temporality is not neutral here. It affects how we approach problems, and in particular, the nature of the nuclear problem. And this bias of short-term focus afflicts us all, but it is most acute for policymakers who are worrying about the midterms. They're worrying about the next election. They're worrying about the next crisis. And the thing about arms control and disarmament, from a temporal point of view, from the point of view of time, is the costs are up front. The benefits come later, and they come mostly to generations yet to come. And it's difficult. This work is, negotiating nuclear agreements is not fun, and it's not easy. It takes time and political capital, and at a certain point, it just becomes easier to push it off to the next guy. Our short-term bias, our sense of place, lead us to push on, to ignore the danger of nuclear weapons, to focus on the danger posed by the rival. And then when we finally do get to nuclear weapons, the inclination is to push it off because we're concerned with the near term and the costs we have to pay today, not the costs we have to pay tomorrow. The necessity of art for survival boils down to the fact that art can make visible the hidden so that we can see and feel the danger. Art can imagine what we face before it happens so it's not too late. Art can redefine our understanding of place. What is place? Who shares this place with us? And what are the threats to place? And finally, it can transform our sense of time so that we can grasp the urgency of the task before us. So thank you, swans, and all of you, everyone in this audience, all of you who are working to save us, and all who will follow, whose names we will never know, from the threat of self-destruction. That's the end, or maybe the beginning. We'll just have to wait and see. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce David Richardson and keep us moving along. As I mentioned earlier, David Richardson is the Associate Dean of Research and Professor of Environmental and Occupational Health at the University of California in Irvine. He is an internationally recognized researcher and expert in occupational health. With this background, his work involves designing studies that allow researchers to explore potential occupational health hazards so employers and policymakers can construct safer working environments. Some of Dr. Richardson's research interests include the health effects of occupational and environmental exposures, as well as injury surveillance and development of novel methods of epidemiology. Dr. Richardson received his MSPH and PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So after David's presentation, Ellen O'Hara-Slavic, as I mentioned earlier, one of our exhibiting artists, will be joining both David and Jim on stage to facilitate a Q&A. So I'm going to read Ellen's bio, and then we'll have David come up. Ellen O'Hara-Slavic is an interdisciplinary artist, poet, professor, curator, critic, and activist. She was the artist in residence in the College of Health Sciences at UC Irvine from 2022 to 2025, and the Huntington Art and Research Fellow at Caltech in 2022. She was a professor of visual art theory and practice at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for 27 years. She received her MFA in photography from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and her BA from Sarah Lawrence College. So please join me in welcoming David Richardson.
Thank you, and thank you for that fantastic talk. That was sobering and inspiring at the same time, which is perfect. Let me ask, just at the start, how is the sound? Can you hear me in the back? Is that okay? And if at any time my voice begins to diminish and you can't hear me, you're completely free and invited to call out and say, "Speak up, David," which is what my mother would do. I'm going to talk about harnessing nuclear forces, the release of radiation, which is, radiation is just energy that's moving through space. Some of you out there are radiant right now. Your force is coming out towards me, and that's what we mean by radiation. And it can have effects on us, and I want to speak about those. So I'm going to start the story much earlier, a long time ago. The gods, cosmic forces, were playing with alchemy. And that sounds mythological or fantastical, but in fact it's true. Alchemy can happen. Matter can be transformed, one natural element to another, to elements which are not natural at all and shouldn't exist. They become heavier than lead. And those transformations, those transmutations, that alchemy happens under impossibly, inconceivably high temperatures and incredible pressures. And we see the traces of that alchemy still on the earth today, scattered and just in the crust, in the soil, little bits of uranium, a metal which, again, is heavier than lead, was created by the collapsing of stars, and holds within it the potential energy of those collapsed stars. It wasn't until just about the beginning of the 20th century, just before, in France, that Henri Becquerel began to recognize that this existed on Earth, that there were these fantastical elements. The photograph here, and this is the birth of the atomic age, begins with the visual arts, with photography. Becquerel set a rock, pitchblende, coming from the mines in Germany that they were digging for, they had been digging back to the 15th century for silver, and throwing pitchblende out as waste. He set a piece on an envelope of film and had intended to expose it, but put it away in a dark drawer, and fantastically, it left its trace on the photographic film, despite the fact that sunshine had never touched the photographic film. And this was this beginning of an insight that there were waves, non-visible waves of energy coming out of this material. Quickly thereafter, the famous Madame Curie begins exploring with this and discovering new elements, polonium, radium, these which were evolving and transmuting spontaneously through themselves, this cascade of moving towards lighter and lighter elements. And so we'll start there. Within a couple decades, we get to 1945. So this is all of this activity is happening, let's say, between 1896, 1897, a few decades later. And by 1945, at the Alamogordo bombing range, just south of Los Alamos, a couple hundred miles, the first weapon on Earth, a nuclear weapon, is detonated. A weapon unknown to humanity before, a weapon using a material which existed in the smallest infinitesimal traces on this planet before that, plutonium. And the plutonium was going to be forged through playing with the uranium. Two hemispheres of metal, not very big at all. with the capacity within them, which was fantastical. Brigadier Thomas Farrell, who was asked to sign a receipt for receiving these cores, later recalled, "If I was going to sign a piece of paper, shouldn't I take it and handle it just to make sure it's real? So I take this heavy ball in my hand and I feel it growing warm. I get a certain sense of the hidden power within it. This is not a cold piece of metal. It's really a piece of metal that seems to be working inside itself. For the first time, I begin to believe some of the fantastic tales that the scientists had told about this nuclear power." And I'm just repeating some of these fantastical tales to you today again, to give you an impression about what we're playing with. Just a few weeks after the Trinity test, on August 6, 1945, a subsequent nuclear weapons detonated in Hiroshima. Here it's using just uranium. And when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the population of Hiroshima was probably about 350,000 people, so not a large city. And yet, it's still not reliably known how many people survived that attack. There were large numbers of deaths. There clearly, roughly a third of the population was promptly killed by the detonation of the bomb. And that was through the physical energy of the blast, from the heat which came out of it, and then through radiation. And I'm going to focus on the consequences of the radiation, but in no way diminishing the fact that tremendous killing occurred promptly with over 100,000 people, let's put it in that ballpark, who were killed. And I just want to take a pause to understand what that brute force meant. Sometimes people would say that the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was a 16 kiloton weapon, saying it had something like the force equivalent of exploding 16,000 tons of TNT. Many of you don't think in tons. You think more in the weights of grapefruits or apples or something. It's in pounds. 16,000 tons is 32 million pounds of TNT, to get a sense of the blast that occurred. And yet it was a hugely inefficient nuclear weapon. It was a nuclear weapon that was designed because it was so simple, it was sure to go off. It was basically keeping the two pieces separated until you're going to rocket one piece against the other. And it blew itself apart because that was what was going to happen. So inside it, there was something like 140 pounds of enriched uranium. Almost all of that, so the 140 pounds of enriched uranium, 32 million pounds of TNT and force equivalent, but it was such a crappy bomb in the sense that about a pound of that enriched uranium actually fissioned itself, and the rest was just blown apart and scattered across the city. Something else remarkable about this, just to get this into scale, all of the energy came out of the transformation of a very, very small amount of that 1 pound of uranium from uranium into energy. About 1 gram, which is, now let's again put this into your sense, half an M&M, or the weight of a butterfly, actually vanished from the earth and became energy. And that's what killed 100,000 people in the flash of an instant. So the weapons we're talking about, again, these are of biblical proportions. And a 16 kiloton device is today considered a dirty bomb. We talk about megaton weapons now. And so, yet, if you walk through the streets of Hiroshima, if you see the city, it's been profoundly transformed by that, the loss of the weight of a butterfly of material and its transformation into energy. Before the bomb was dropped, the US flew planes over it for aerial surveillance. The undertaking to create that weapon we'll get to, but was arguably the largest investment in science and technology the world had ever seen or will ever see. In order to, and I'll talk about this, but the industry necessary to enrich and refine that material overtook the size of the US auto industry during World War II. There were more people involved in that. And so they wanted to know what was going to happen. They flew a plane over it, and according to the people I've talked to, fitted onto the bottom of the plane was an enormous Rolleiflex camera. If you ever saw reporters in movies in the 1940s and 50s, they would wear a camera strapped around, and they would look down over the top. This is basically what they built, but enormous. So that the size of the negative was not 2 inches by 2 inches or 4 inches by 5 inches. The size of the negative was intended to be the size of a military map, so that you could have a picture, a photographic documentation, and you could direct contact print that and set it against military maps at the time. That's surveillance. This is a pre-photograph and a post-photograph. You can see within a kilometer or so outside of the city, basically everything, almost everything is decimated, again, by this very primitive, dirty bomb. Those photographs would be coupled with detailed maps. And then a second scientific project begins. No longer the creation of the bomb, but a project to study the consequences of the bomb and really to understand what the effect of this weapon is. And this is going to take decades, and it's going to involve incredible activities, reconstruction of model Japanese cities and dropping of other test weapons to understand the doses, lifting nuclear reactors in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, lifting the core out to understand the relationship between the dose from the gamma rays and the neutrons. So mapping, placing of individuals, and then for years sending out jeeps to go and identify those people who had survived and interview them individual by individual, sending not only us an anthropologist to take an oral history of each household, but an architect to draw each home. These are maps. They are very detailed now of one street that's going to undergo interviews as in a census, an interviewer coming to the house, drawing the house, and then placing each individual within the room in the house and drawing a line of sight to where the detonation occurred. It's going upwards because the blast occurred above street level. It detonated in the air, and it has a line of sight. And then there's an oral history with each of these. I was standing in the house. I was washing the dishes. A flash of light went off. It blew me back across the room. My daughter was playing in the front yard. This is the last I ever saw of her. We found her belt buckle and nothing more. My other daughter was at school, and she was not there at the time that the bomb went off. Exists today a manila envelope for each household, a documentation house by house of those who survived. And again, we'll say 100,000 of those 350,000 people never survived long enough to take these oral histories. These are the stories of the survivors. And this is going to become the basis for long-term understanding of two things. The scientists who continue to do this work are primarily interested in the long-term effects of exposures to radiation from all sources, not simply weapons. But if you ask your doctor today, what's the consequence of receiving a CT scan, they're going to say what we know about the risk, the long-term risk of cancer per unit dose comes from the study of the atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for better or worse. But another view, and I would argue a view which is the minority view, a very, very small fractional view, is it's a study of the long-term consequences of nuclear warfare. We've had very little experience with this, and yet we can say 2 nuclear weapons dropped on civilian populations. We're continuing to study the consequences 70 or 80 years later, and we can still see, dramatically see, the pulse of disease that's following with those survivors. And there are long-term questions still about whether those consequences end with the current survivors or whether they will be passed on to the second generation. This is a map of each of those households. A dot represents a person who survived. The colors of the dots are estimates of the radiation doses. The colors are varying because the radiation dose diminishes with distance. But it's also going to vary because different people had different types of shielding, trees and hills and buildings, which will shield part or the whole body. There's a remarkable kind of story about why are there any, if you see, there's a gap there. It looks like a donut. There's a hole. There are very, very few people who survived. That's the middle of the hole is the absence of survivors. But there are few people who did survive, and how could you possibly survive that? And they have stories like a man who worked in a bank had been sent down to the archives, and he happened to be under a large steel vault at the time that the nuclear bomb went out. And then he steps out, and he's in the middle of town, and there's almost nobody around him. So what can we say? And these are, we spoke briefly about the prompt effects and the late effects. I'm just going to have a few observations about the late effects, broad strokes. One, the graph on the left is showing that the risk of cancer increases essentially proportional to dose. The closer you were to the center, if you survived, is the higher the dose, and the higher the excess rate of cancer is going to be into the future. The further you get from where the bomb detonation occurred, the lower your dose, and the closer your cancer rate is going to be to people who did not happen to be in Hiroshima at the days that the bombing went off. And the risk is increasing. There's a straight line that's fitted to the kind of cancer rates, and it very much is basically the rate is increasing proportional to the amount of energy that passed through the people. That became, and that's, we can speak about it later, as an issue which the federal government is viewing as contentious today, but I think the empirical evidence is pretty strong. The other side is some work related to the persistence of the effect and the types of diseases. In Hiroshima, it was very clear within a year or two after the bomb went off, this prompt peak of leukemias, and specifically what's called acute myeloid leukemia. These are relative rates, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 times above the baseline rate, above what would have been expected. This remarkable excess of leukemias which passed through. And yet, even as we get out 50 or 60 years past, I would just note, it's something like 20 to 30% of the leukemias which are seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki among survivors today remain radiation-associated excesses. So this is now, we're talking about excesses of 0.3. It looks small compared to excesses of 70-fold, and yet it's still remarkable. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? I have a few minutes. I have too many stories to tell. I just want to pivot very briefly to say that this, after World War II, that wasn't the end of the story at all. This is, in fact, the beginning of the story. And the pictures we saw of the remarkable expansion of the nuclear arsenal is in part driven by people like this. It was no longer just the United States involved in the production of nuclear weapons. The UK, Canada, France all quickly joined into it, followed by the Soviet Union. The weapons labs began to develop not just the use of nuclear technologies for weaponry, but then to expand into the promotion of nuclear reactors. Oak Ridge National Lab, the place which had enriched the uranium, began to spin a small turbine generating electricity, the world's first nuclear power generation. This was going to be followed at Idaho National Lab, and then the Soviet Union at Obninsk, where they actually began to power a city, and then in the US in Shippingport, and in the UK at Calder Hall. Those two technologies became very much entwined, and there was an intentionality there. The workforce, as I said, expanded dramatically. By the end of the Manhattan Project, there were 130,000 people working in the industry, and that, again, did not close. That, in fact, expanded as the footprint expanded to fuel the generation of all these new, the growth of the weapons and also the new uses and applications of nuclear technologies. For the last 20 years, I've been working on a coordination between the US, the UK, and France on a comprehensive study of all the people who worked in these industries, from the Manhattan Project forward across for the French and the UK systems as well, involving both civil as well as military workers. And the goal has been to understand the relationships between the risks that we see in Hiroshima and Nagasaki from a prompt blast of a bomb to people who are working in the industry who produce those weapons and what the consequences are there, as well as all the people who are continuing today to work in this large complex, from uranium enrichment through to weapons production and power generation. And ask the questions, what do we know about what happens in these more mundane situations day to day? Again, photography plays a huge role in this. For the atomic bomb survivors, there were aerial photographs and then placing people into locations. The workers at this site, the way that their exposures have been measured was photographically for a very, very long period of time. This is a picture at one of the facilities, Argonne, near Chicago. Anybody walking on site and from the Manhattan Project forward into a secure nuclear facility was going to wear an identification badge that had their photograph on it, and then hidden behind the photograph is a secret compartment. And inside the compartment, again, is a packet of film, which will never be exposed to sunlight. But as they're walking through radiation fields, that film will darken proportional to the amount of radiation that's moving through the badge, past their own picture, and through the film packet. And then that gets read, and the radiation is proportional to how dark the film got. That became a basis for us to study hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workers, all of them individually monitored for radiation. And I'll just give you one or two insights, quickly, broad strokes again. We've been using these to look internationally at cancer rates. The rows are just different categories of causes of death. Cancers, solid cancers are cancers other than those which are liquid, so leukemias and lymphomas. And we're showing the numbers of deaths among 300,000 workers, and then the excess rate per unit radiation exposure, per gray. The first row is cancer, and there's about 31,000 deaths observed. 10% of the workers so far have died of cancer. And about a 50% excess per gray of cancer. So for a gray is 1 unit of radiation exposure, about a 50% excess. If you drop the leukemias out, just looking at the solid cancers, the excess just diminishes slightly. What that's signaling is leukemia is very rare, but the risk of leukemia is greater than the risks for the solid cancers. And then we can go through. Lung cancer is the leading solid cancer that's seen among these workers. But the results are not solely driven by lung cancers. There's an increase in most types of solid cancers, in fact. And the relationship, again, looks like a straight line is not a bad description of it. The risk is increasing proportional. And so on the x-axis is doses. These are much, much lower doses than the bomb survivors had. And they're being received day after day. And the increase in cancer is going up proportionally. And it persists now for 50, 60 years. So just a few last observations. The 20th century brought with it the recognition of the existence of alchemy and transmutation of elements, these nuclear forces. And within a few decades, we had gone from recognition of that scientific fact to the development of weapons with incredible powers. And I absolutely agree with this kind of the problem of short-term thinking when understanding the consequences of nuclear weapons is catastrophic. A bomb detonates in Hiroshima in 1945, and the consequences are still being seen 80 years later, and the worry and the persistence of those hazards will hang with us for centuries or generations. I can say that with confidence at this point. The susceptibility of harms, those dramatic elevations, that was reflecting the exquisite sensitivity of children to the consequences of radiation. That 70-fold excess is the 70-fold excess of pediatric leukemias, which is a terrible disease. And so we can't think in generalities either. There are differences in any population which is facing the consequences of nuclear warfare. The proportionality of risks is just a clear one. This message coming out that we may diminish the doses from these, but we continue to see, even when they're split up over time and they're in small increments, the accrual of damage from the use of these weapons. And that comes from their production, their testing, their use, all the way through. This is not something, again, to be trivial about. I'll stop there and we can have some discussion about the challenges, but thank you.
Now, did I mention it's a beautiful day today? I don't mind. Sharing is caring.
Is it on? Do I have to turn it on or
Hello. Hello.
Work? Hello? Okay, great. Hi, I'm Ellen. Thanks, everybody, for coming. You guys are, I wish you were in the pictures of the 9 leaders. I'd feel a lot better if you guys were them instead of those bozos. I really just can't believe it. But I don't even know where to start, but I thought I would start by, you guys just met today, and I was blown away by both of your talks, and I thought maybe you guys had questions for each other that could get the conversation going. So if you do, if you don't, I have some.
I just have a couple of, I thought it was a wonderful talk. I thought you gave a wonderful talk. And I learned, despite 20 years at this business, I still learned a tremendous amount. But 2 random things. One, little known to me, University of North Carolina seems to be a powerhouse when it comes to nuclear stuff. You and the artists, and my daughter went to UNC in peace and security program there. So, but the other thing, I love this phrase, which I will steal. Alchemy happens. I love that. But I learned so much, it's too much for me to comment on. But even the visuals, like that map with the individual dots itself is kind of a work of art, is it not? So I thought it was a beautiful presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, that's very kind of you, and the admiration's mutual. And so I had one thought, or one question was, you had put forward this observation that if we see danger differently, we can change the ways that we approach it. And that resonated with me. I recently went back to a quote that I'd heard from the mayor of Hiroshima, which was that the lesson of nuclear weapons is that we need to figure out how to live together peacefully. But that peace doesn't come by us hoping for peace. We need to approach it as a question in which we study what are the conditions and barriers to peace and address it in a studied and thoughtful way. And Maybe I'll stop there and just ask if you would reflect about that and about I think it's partly about you seem to have had a lot of experience in thinking about what are the structures for peace, and how does art intersect with those? And I think you began to point to some of those elements, but that seemed really useful and productive.
Oh, well, thank you. My response has two parts. And the first is to back away a little bit on this. Like some people in this room, I'm anti-imperialist feminist on the left rather than the right. I would love to abolish war, right, and tyranny. But I don't, I think there's some confusion among folks who are concerned about nuclear weapons, and part of this has historical origins, right? The anti-nuclear movement comes out of the peace movement, right, which is an anti-war movement. Now, as a guy who studies war, I think we're going to have to learn how to give up nuclear weapons because that seems like the easier task than abolishing war. And if we wait to abolish war first before we give up the nuclear weapons, then we will get nuclear war. So I'm opposed to war. But I think we need to distinguish those two things as we design strategies for social change. We still have to keep the anti-war camp with us, right? And I share those norms and values. But we've got more important work that has to be done first. So let us first take the steps necessary to dismantle nuclear weapons, to do something we've already done 60,000 times. And then once we reach that point, and the security challenges, there will be security challenges that flow from that, right? The other thing that my colleagues, my friends have to think about that is difficult to embrace is it's not only about stopping, it's not just the fact that war is a harder problem than getting rid of nuclear weapons. There's a second issue, and which I've now forgotten. So, see, this is what happens. This is the problem. Who are these people in the room? You're all like me. You're old, right? So you get going on that idea, and it's spinning in your head, and then it goes away. But now I remember what it was. I just needed to buy a little time, a little song and dance to get me through. And here's the other issue with it. It is partly that you should try to go after nuclear weapons first and then war. And the second is, to be effective, we need to admit the fact that it is not unreasonable for people to think that nuclear weapons have benefits, right? We know that the benefits the harms outweigh the benefits. But if you're a decision maker, you think, well, nuclear weapons aren't perfect, but they're deterring other people from attacking me. And there's value in that. What allows them to continue to hold on to the nuclear weapons and to see it as benefit rather than risk is the time horizon and their sense of place. That's really what I was trying to get at. If you change the time horizon, then this thing that looks like it's paying benefits today will be realized for what it is, which is death tomorrow. And if you change your frame of place, that it's not me versus Russia or me versus China, it's me versus destruction and annihilation. And which threat ranks first there? Untied to place, tied to technology and weapon. Now, that doesn't mean I give up being an American. For some people, and I am more inclined to this than others, I believe in a global vision and international order, but I don't think you have to believe in those things. What you have to believe is that we just need to find a place where we all don't kill each other by mistake. And part of it is getting people to understand in this sense of place. I'm glad you asked me this, and then I'll stop now that I've gone on for 20 minutes. Forgetting things slows me down. Sense of place is also in this, comes into the fore because we think, a lot of Americans think, if there's a nuclear war, we're going to be in it, and if we're in charge or we're involved, it's all going to come out okay. Either we'll win, whatever that means, or it won't happen, but we have a sense that if we're involved, and we will because we're the most important and powerful country in the world, it's all going to work out. That ignores the fact that two countries can have a nuclear war and wipe out the United States. Our nuclear weapons do not deter war between two other rivals who are fighting on their own. And if they have a nuclear war, the climate effects of that, particularly in the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere, could be cataclysmic. So the place does not reside in where even the weapons are launched or land. Because regardless of where they're launched, and regardless of where they land, wherever you are in the world, you're running the risk of being no more. Now, the Europeans had a very fine sense of this during the 80s, as they were bystanders and they saw the risk of war between the Soviets and the US go up. They had no control over it. If we fought a war, they were going to lose. But we are those people now. If two other countries fight a war, we will lose. So we need to redefine the sense of place. But thanks for hanging in me with that. Sorry.
So I don't know. It might take me a while to get to the question, but because the U.S. and France, at least those two countries, are trying to fast-track new nuclear power plants, nuclear energy, which so many people do think is the answer to solve fossil fuel problems, right? Like, that's the answer. Like, oh, well, what are you going to do with the waste? Oh, well, we'll build the nuclear power plants to fuel the AI that will solve the nuclear waste problem. I mean, it's batshit crazy. It really is insane. But so they're trying to fast track these plants, and I know we can't predict the future, but it does really make me worried that, you know, we're going to have all these new plants that will fuel the weapons, because the weapons depend on the plutonium that's manufactured at the plants. And I don't know. I know where I'm not alone in feeling like it could be Armageddon. It really could be the end of the world as we know it any day. And I do appreciate the successes that you talked about. And you, in a previous talk that I was with David, he talked about it too, like, good for us. You know, we haven't annihilated ourselves. And yet we have done over 2,000 nuclear tests, which each one of those nuclear tests was a bomb, a real bomb. You know, it wasn't just a blip, it was a full-on bomb. And so I don't know if we really haven't used, in wartime, right? We are the only country to have dropped 2 nuclear bombs during wartime, supposedly. But anyway, so my question is, I know we can't predict the future, but could you try? Could you, like, at least try to tell us what you think might happen or what is coming as a result of where we are now with most people? I mean, right now, the majority of this country supports nuclear, which wasn't the case when I was a child. It was predominantly anti-nuclear. So anyway, if you could just speak to that.
You want that one?
I can have an initial take. There's clearly a large push for expansion of nuclear technologies on a lot of fronts. And I think it's also going to face very, very strong headwinds. Discussions in the past with utilities was that the economic basis for nuclear power wasn't there. And I think the state of California is really doing a fantastic job of demonstrating alternative paths forward, which do not require additional nuclear reactors for a stable electrical grid. And so there's going to be that opposition on the economic logic side. Globally, the licensing of small modular reactors is run into a second one, which is an interesting, these are all, in the end, political and economic decisions, but the political one is many regulators are asking for justification. They're saying simply the fact that you can build a small modular reactor does not justify that you should build a small modular reactor. You have to make the case against the alternative. The occupational and environmental consequences of those reactors per unit energy generated is just worse. So they would say, why wouldn't you come forward with a case for an existing 1970s design, which would actually be safer per capita per unit energy generated? So I think they're going to face these headwinds. That's, again, not to say that there's not strong political support and enthusiasm for greasing the track forward. The other concern, and I think we're seeing this as there's been targeting of reactors in Ukraine, in Israel, and Iran, is at some point you step back and you say, do we want an expansion of the number of sites which are vulnerable as either for malicious or an intentional targeting? And so there are kind of, it's a fascinating technology. I like the physics. I like the engineering components to it. But there are real reasons to have hesitancy about the way that we proliferate this, whether it's weapons or power.
Well, I think that's a great answer, and I think I'm going to stick with that. But I think it continues to face economic problems. If you look at the chart that even the industry puts out, the nuclear power associations put out, it's been flat for a long time, and the base case is, flat to down. So that's good. The thing has to make money. One thing about the bombs don't have to make money, but the power plants have to make money, and that's going to be a constraint on them. And that will be, and if it progresses in that area, it will be as robust as the next nuclear accident. And then it will all come to a grinding halt, which is different from nuclear weapons, maybe or maybe not. Maybe if there's a nuclear use or a nuclear scare. Remember, it was Reagan didn't use nuclear weapons, he just scared us all, and that caused a political mobilization that led to INF and other sorts of arms control and disarmament measures. So we don't have to have a nuclear war to galvanize public opinion. But, it's the concern would be that would happen. With a nuclear accident, you'll survive, the industry will take a hit, and you can keep on going. You have a big nuclear war, not really sure that's going to be the case. Now, I'm going to take this moment and talk very briefly at the core of your question, I think. I've been at this a long time. And as I look at the future, I got to say that I don't feel great, right? I've spent a good part of my professional career on two things: getting the JCPOA and preventing a war in Iran, because a war in Iran would cause an Iranian nuclear weapon. Neither of those have gone well. And, the thing, because we have a changing international system, it seems like there will be more conflict and more polarity and a decline in the international system that has served us so well, particularly on this issue, on the issue of the nuclear threat. Now, my daughter tells me I shouldn't say this because it's not persuasive, especially to a younger audience. And you look pretty young, but I'm going to say it anyway. Part of it is my old college existentialist reading, and part of it is deep philosophical skepticism. I don't think we can know the future, and that's a liberating thing. If I knew the future and it was bad, what would I do? If I was sure that it was all going to be crap, it would be hard to get up and do the work that needs to be done. But I don't know, and I can't know in principle. And surprise, which happens to us all the time, is the God's way of telling us that our theories are wrong. And we're constantly surprised. So rather than bet on my infallibility, I would rather bet on my errors and say, we don't know, there's play in the system. Things can happen and go in either direction, for good or for ill. And that leaves me the space of freedom and agency to do what I think is right. And so I think because we don't know the future, we have the freedom to make a different future. And even though it's tough right now, that's what I cling to.
That's great. Yeah, Howard Zinn, who I happen to know, which is a great honor in my life, he told me that if we can't imagine a world without nuclear weapons, we will not have a world without nuclear weapons. We have to imagine it, and we have to work for it. So I love that. So I think we should open it to the audience if people have any questions. And I think there is a mic out there. So if you have any questions, yes. I don't know where the mic is. Oh, the mic's up there. Or, oh, right there, yes.
Hi. Both of you must be nuclear scientists or related to nuclear science. Can you get your colleagues all over the country to get together to write letters, to talk to the newspapers, to convince the American people that these weapons have to stop, have to be dismantled?
Let me say that most of my colleagues in security studies think nuclear weapons have benefits.
What benefits?
That they enhance near-term security, that they deter a country from attacking you, that they make them more cautious. I think those things, by the way, are true, not as robustly as my colleagues do, but I think we have to be able to read the world as it is if we're going to persuade people to give them up. I think we have to admit that it makes other countries cautious about fighting, but it doesn't eliminate the war. That's the problem. And so when it finally does come, it's really, really, really bad. So what's happened is, as political saliency for nuclear weapons and nuclear war has declined since the end of the Cold War, everyone's gotten out of it. They're into climate change. They're into X. They're into Y, right? No one cares about my issue anymore. So when that happens, the space, social space for that gets narrower and narrower and shrinks and shrinks. And who's left? The military guys, the think tank guys, and my colleagues in security studies. So with the decline in political saliency, you have a narrowing of thinking about nuclear weapons, and most of that narrowing has been to not even consider arms control and disarmament, but how to improve, what do the people say now? How to keep the nuclear peace. That's what people say. So they would not be my first constituency. Nevertheless, if we're going to be successful, we have to be able to answer those arguments. We cannot just, right now we're all talking past each other. We say nuclear weapons are dangerous. They say they're beneficial, and we each live in our own house and say that to each other. We have to be able to go to them and say, I hear what you're saying, and I think you're partially right, but you are missing the big picture. We have to take that to them and take it to the public as well.
But there's no evidence that these weapons provide any benefits.
Well, that would be a tough sell. Again, it depends on your time frame, right? One of the biggest things in history that states feared was being conquered. Like, that was the big thing. Some big state's going to conquer my little state, and I'm going to be enslaved. That happened all the time. Nuclear weapons make that hard. It's hard to, invade another state if they have nuclear weapons. People were constantly saying, Iran's mistake was that they didn't go for the bomb. Ukraine's mistake was that they didn't keep their nuclear weapons. And they say that because it is true. If a country has nuclear weapons, yeah, you're going to think twice about invading them. Well, let's just get real about that. But the question is, what is the value of that benefit against long-term annihilation? That's the difference, the near term versus the short term. Thank you.
How to redirect back to detente versus changing the name of our Pentagon from Department of Defense to Department of War may have something to do with it, as well as so many more countries have nukes now than did in 1945.
Thank you so much for an incredible talk. One of the things that I'm trying to think about is, even though we read in the news about the wars that we're waging in the Gulf around oil, thinking about the Pacific Ocean, and particular about the fact that we bombed Bikini Atoll and then Japan twice, and then the Fukushima disaster. So the Pacific Ocean itself seems to be a living organism, the largest ocean on planet Earth, and I'm not hearing very much conversation about the environmental, non-specific, like global war situation, but just the cost of the testing. And that made me think again about during mid-century modernism that we tested several nuclear weapons in the Great Basin. All of the rivers in the Great Basin move into the Pacific Ocean as well as the dust that gets airborne moving into the Pacific Ocean. And so that's a kind of invisible, non-geopolitical narrative which has very physical reality about it. And I guess my question is this accurate? And how can we understand the risk to the intermingled organisms that make life on Earth possible and the legacy of all of this testing in the 20th and 21st century?
I'm definitely going to let them answer, but I just want to say, because I've done drawings and work about the Bikini Atoll, we did 54. We didn't just bomb Bikini Atoll. We dropped 54. We did 54 atomic bomb tests in Bikini Atoll, including the biggest one we ever dropped. We vaporized 3 islands. We poisoned, I think, 70,000 miles. So I just wanted to, just in case people didn't know how serious it really was.
Yeah, well, it's a great question and a great observation. What we call background radiation today on the planet is different than what we called background radiation prior to 1943, 44. We've changed that by not just the creation and testing of the weapons, but there's a whole kind of cycle of waste which comes with the production and shouldn't be discounted. Here on the Pacific Coast locally, I think one of the important concerns is we treated the Pacific as, they used to say, there was the solution to the pollution was dilution. And that was true with, for example, Atomics International, which was working in Los Angeles with their sodium reactors, just put their liquid waste right out into the Pacific in barrels, and it's there today. Or you hope it's there. It's moving around there today. Just one last little observation about this. I used to work with somebody who was part of the system which did surveillance for the testing of weapons. At one point, he wanted water which had no radiological contamination. So he needed to find fluid samples that go back to the 1940s. The only place he could find it was to go and purchase some very, very expensive bottles of wine from pre-1945, and then evaporate the alcohol off, dispose of the wine. The wine producers were furious about it. But in order to have these test samples, which they could use as true blanks in the evaluation, because the planet is that contaminated. One cannot find water which is not carrying the traces of these technologies now.
Even in glacial ice?
No, I think that would have been the alternative. It's much nicer to get a really good bottle of wine.
Yeah. So we can take one more question. Sheila. Here. Sheila's one of the swans.
I don't mean to stop anybody else from asking a question, but you did mention that the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was a dirty bomb. And my question is, are the bombs today, the nuclear bombs, any cleaner?
That's a great question, and they're different. And in the sense of dirty is just largely that it's inefficient, and it's actually just spewing a lot of its material unfissioned out into the environment. And so today, yes, they're much more efficient. The yield is orders of magnitude larger. The energy that's going to come off of them is larger. The devastation promptly is going to be different, and there's going to be just less, of that enriched uranium which is just thrown out, scattered around. In Hiroshima, I mean, people were actually feeling the lingering effects of this enriched uranium around there until eventually there were heavy rains which came and washed it out again into the sea. And then finally people stopped feeling the sort of diarrhea and other illnesses which were just kind of coming from the environmental contamination.
I would only say briefly that I agree with that absolutely. We've just gotten much better at building killing machines. We're just way, way better at it. But I would say the danger now, though, in the contemporary policy context, is a little different, at least from the U.S. perspective. We're into building small nuclear weapons. And you say, oh, well, that's better. No, it's not better, because what that's doing is, this is the defense planners saying, we want to give, this scenario could happen where we would suddenly be caught and someone would do something and we wouldn't have an appropriate response. So since my job is to make options for the president, I'm going to recommend that we have every kind of nuclear weapon possible so that we have every option for every contingency. If you do that, you will find the opportunity to use nuclear weapons. Right? That's it's the reverse of how a nuclear weapons free zone works, or some of the other special prohibitions that we have, which is we're going to say, hands off, we're staying away from this thing. In that case, the nuclear weapons free zone is a geographic space. No nuclear weapons in that space. Not we're going to have a little and we're going to regulate it. No, we're just going to keep that clean. And what we're saying here is, rather than be constrained by the enormous power of our nuclear weapons and their destructiveness, which induces caution for a while, for some people, for some presidents. No, we're going to build the really small ones so we can use them, and then if they respond, we'll threaten them by going after their nuclear weapon sites. We will have a counterforce damage limitation strategy so that they won't dare respond. I think I've heard that recently. They wouldn't dare respond. They won't dare respond. So we can use the small one and come out the winner. And it's just a complete fantasy. But that is the center of gravity in nuclear weapon design and thinking today in the modern U.S. military. More options, smaller options, so we don't get stuck where we're in a situation where we wish we had one.
So I just wanted to say that there are two galleries. Now we're having a break for food and for you to see the show, and they're in both galleries, and maybe Emily will add some more information. But please come back for the afternoon session with the artists. And thank you, everybody. And thank you both so much.
Thank you all for wonderful presentations and a generative conversation, and I'm sorry to be cutting it off, but we will continue it in the afternoon with another panel starting at 2:15. So we have about a little bit over an hour to grab some lunch, which we have in the lobby, as well as give you all time to visit the exhibition. So I put some images of our galleries up just in case you need some help with wayfinding. And there are maps in the lobby as well, but we'll see you all in the afternoon. And thank you all again.
Just because I've been here many times, if you don't know the campus, it's really easy. The Broad Center is right out to the left, and then if you just walk straight across campus, the building you hit is the other building where the other gallery is. So they're just right across from each other, and they're like a minute apart.
Thanks, Ellen.
Can I see those pictures?
Oh, sure. I'll leave them up.
Yes, 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 yes. Yes.